koskettelemme ihmisen, hänen maailmankuvansa.
We are touching on an individual's personal worldview, where we come from, why we are here, questions like that. These are not comfortable questions. They affect the way we think and feel about things.
Some of my colleagues don't like that I am critical towards the theory of evolution, and they don't like to discuss with me. They believe that the point of view I take is out of discussion at all.
It is not felt to be a legitimate part of a course outline or a course content to give counter arguments against the general Darwinian view, and certainly not thought to be permissible to give any kind of serious discussion of alternative interpretation.
(1831). His Majesty's ship Beagle left London for a scientific expedition around the world. The young theological student Charles Darwin was invited along as naturalist. He was young and inexperienced, but he had a passionate desire to study nature.
I was much struck with certain facts which seemed to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries.
"5 years later, Darwin returned. He had abandoned his faith that species had been created individually. He published his theory after 20 years of dedicated research.
I can entertain no doubt that the view which most naturalists until recently entertained, and which I formerly entertained, namely that each species had been independently created, is erroneous."
The new theory gave rise to a storm of protest. Many of the conservative thinkers of the time thought Darwin's ideas were heresy. He became a subject for ridicule and was lampooned in cartoons. There was, however, great interest in Darwin's thoughts. The first edition of The Origin of Species was sold out on the first day. Little by little, his theory was accepted as the explanation for the origin of species. The old theory of creation gave way to a new way of looking at natural history. Naturalists had found their own answer to a great mystery. At the beginning of the 70s, a young Finnish researcher, Matti Leisala, started to doubt the evidence for evolution. And becoming familiar with the material, he wrote an article which was critical of evolutionary theory. Hesitating over his own conclusions, he had the text checked by numerous experts in their own fields.
Eräs professori tuli huoneeseeni, pani oven kiinni ja sanoi, että
One day, a professor walked into my room, closed the door and said, "The article is excellent, but please don't associate my name with it publicly." Many other Finnish naturalists have expressed the same opinion, but don't want to speak publicly about their doubts. Scientists are just like everybody else. They worry about their reputations, their jobs, their futures. Criticizing Darwin's theories is liable to damage all these, and also their career opportunities.
Professor Dean H. Kenyon taught development biology at San Francisco State University and is an acknowledged expert in his own field. He has written a book about lifeless chemicals becoming living organisms.
And so I guess I would say I was a convinced neo-Darwinist and a chemical evolutionist. It became increasingly difficult for me to provide examples of actually observed evolutionary change for my students. Unfortunately, I am not allowed to discuss these topics in my courses here at San Francisco State.
After some stormy criticism, Professor Kenyon eventually received official permission to teach his critical viewpoint to students. Munich Technical University's professor of microbiology, Siegfried Scherher, has made a detailed study of species changes. He has found several problematic areas relating to evolutionary theory. Yet many of his professional colleagues are not interested in a detailed study of the problems.
I think it is very disturbing that usually this discussion is very, very difficult. And people are not willing to discuss different points of view, diverging points of view. That things are already settled and they don't like to go into any detail in discussion. So I have to accept this too. I'm sad about this, but well, it's their choice.
The first time I spoke on the radio, I had a very stormy reaction. I began to realize that the whole question was a very much deeper one than merely a question of natural sciences.
In the moment you come to a fanatic sort of point of view and your discussion is fanatic, you will never ever come to a reasonable discussion of the facts. So the prime thing to do is to keep off from fanatic arguments.
Kuuluisa paleontologi, jesuittapa.
The famous Jesuit priest and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin has said that evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines must follow. This is what evolution is.
Täytyy seurata.
The day will come when this will be given as a curious illustration of the blindness of preconceived opinion.
Life is thought to have developed from simple cells to complicated organisms. The concept of evolutionary development is accepted as fact, even though it is still unclear how life originated and how it has developed. The first cell is thought to have developed as a result of a few small changes in the environment. However, the birth of life idea is very difficult to examine scientifically.
We have no data from the past. We have no direct observations of the things which happened 1,000 or 10,000 or millions of years ago. So we have data today, and in order to know how does life come onto this earth, we need to interpret the data.
Darwin suggested at the time that the first cell would have been formed in a small pond, where there were both ammonia and other suitable chemicals.
We may well ask, why should molecules, why should dead chemicals form life? There isn't any apparent reason or purpose in their doing so.
Darwin's theory of natural selection cannot be invoked before the existence of a cell which is capable of reproducing itself.
Before the first cell is there, you can't invoke natural selection. And so it had to be all there at the very beginning, the first living cell, with its 2,000 or 3,000 enzymes, hormones, all these sort of proteins there right at the beginning, making the DNA coding for the enzymes, so the whole lot together, incredibly complex.
In the spring of 1995, there was a conference in which a group of scientists met to discuss one of the problems associated with the origin of life. The conference ended without any definite conclusion.
This pictures the present situation. At the same time as we are told that chemicals created life, that the origin of life is totally clear, Scientists at this conference are of completely different opinions as to whether it is even possible on this Earth. Even this tiny detail is in question.
All experiments which have been done to clarify this point very clearly showed that we do not have a solution to the problem how the first living cell came into existence.
Darwin tried to explain the mystery of the birth of life, but there still hasn't been a satisfactory explanation despite thousands of research projects. The other problem which nags at scientists is, what evidence do we have for the evolution from species to species? Every living creature is a highly complicated unit. Biologists have long tried to explain how each unit's activities are controlled. The secret of all life is inside the cell itself. The cell is like a complicated factory whose activities are controlled by DNA molecules. This molecule carries all the information which is required for life. The component parts of DNA are the letters in the language of life. There is an incredible amount of information in each individual DNA strand. In the human DNA, there is at least as much information as there is in 1,000 books, each of 500 pages.
Vaikka kaikki maailman tieteellinen tieto laitettaisiin yhteen.
If we put together all the knowledge in the world, no scientist could even imagine how to build a living cell. The problem of evolution is, where did the extra information come from? The information which is needed for the individual cell to learn to walk, fly, breathe, run, think, or even smell.
Ajattelemaan, haistamaan.
The more important objections relate to questions on which we are confessedly ignorant. Nor do we know how ignorant we are.
Usually the argument of my colleagues is, well, you're right, we do not know yet how certain evolutionary transitions occurred. We do not know yet. But wait 5 or 10 years and we will have all the answers. That people believe that in the future they will get all the answers we don't have today.
Life is an endless struggle for existence. Natural selection eliminates the weakest and favors the strongest. This is how the species adapt to changes in the environment. However, adaptation can only go as far as the information in the DNA molecule allows. For evolution to happen, the DNA molecule has to receive totally new information. When radiation, chemical reactions, or other outside influences affect the DNA molecule, its letters are either destroyed, duplicated, or muddled up. This is called mutation.
We all people and all humans and all animals and plants have thousands and thousands of neutral mutations, and there are much negative mutations, and there are also very, very small numbers of positive mutations. So we look at the positive mutations because this should be the source of evolution.
According to evolutionary theory, new species arise through positive changes in the DNA molecule. Positive mutations are, nonetheless, exceedingly rare.
We can calculate the probability that one mutation takes place, and we can calculate the probability that 2 or 3 mutations of different kinds would take place. And the more mutations you need, which come together at the same time, the lower gets the probability that such an event occurs.
Evolutionary biologists say that given enough time, millions and millions of years, there might be enough positive mutation to cause an organism to change into another type of organism.
Our observations show that in nature there is a mechanism which does exactly the opposite. It creates inherited mistakes which cause the individual to degenerate.
Now, if we look at this problem, how can a multicellular organism arise from a single-cellular organism? You have probably dozens of genes which must change not only at one point of the gene, but probably at very different points of genes. You have only very small changes, and the small changes go back also, they go forth and go back, so it is around the same level of complexity if you look at the mutation mechanisms.
Professor Scherer has run a series of laboratory tests from which he has produced a variety of rapidly reproducing bacteria. In the experiments, he has tried to establish just how much natural selection can change bacteria.
And the very, very clear result of this experiment was there are little changes in genes, there are changes in different genes of the bacteria, there are small adaptations, but the structure of the bacterial species gets never any change. And this is empirical evidence that there are indeed limits of the microevolutionary processes we have described until now.
So we have to ask, where has the idea come from that mutation can cause something completely new? This is the origin of the belief that mutation is the only mechanism by which we can possibly explain where the new genetic information comes from.
I think that the more we learn in molecular biology and the more we learn from chemical evolution studies, the less likely is it that the chemical evolution explanation is going to turn out to be the right one.
And I believe that we do have a lot of facts available today which give us a good reason to doubt whether Darwin's theory really is the theory which allows us to explain life.
Fossils tell us about prehistoric life. It is possible to follow the development of life by looking at the remains of animals and plants. Darwin thought that the fossil record would prove his theory right.
All the chief laws of paleontology plainly proclaim, it seems to me, that species have been produced by ordinary generation.
During Darwin's days, relatively few fossils were known. The missing ancestors were put into the fossil diagrams because it was assumed that the missing fossils would be found. As more and more fossils have come to light, something entirely unexpected has emerged.
And if you look at the textbooks of universities, you will find the schemes of the evolutionary trees through the fossil records, and in those places where different families and orders would come to the same common ancestor, you would find that the scientists would say this is hypothesis because the connecting link is not yet found.
People spent hours and hours, years and years exploring the fossil record to add to the number of fossils. But really, the situation today is just as it was in Darwin's day. The evidence that Darwin predicted is just not there.
And I find it very interesting that we have the same situation in paleontology and in biology, that we have gaps between major groups which I call basic types.
Archaeopteryx is one of the best-known missing links. When it is examined in detail, it is easy to see the characteristics of both bird and lizard.
The problem is that all these claimed links are actually complete organisms which are fully formed. And like Archaeopteryx, it has reptilian features, it has bird-like features. And yet all the features are mature.
Archaeopteryx was all bird. It had characteristics which are not found in all birds today, but which have occurred in fossil birds. But more even than that, to answer the idea of its being a missing link, is the fact that in the rock deposit in which it is found, the Jurassic, also true living birds have also been found. It argues strongly against Archaeopteryx or any missing link at all.
And this means that Darwin's problem is still with us.
Ellei evoluutiosta olisi tullut
If evolution hadn't become one of the most basic ideas that dominate Western thinking, it would have been abandoned as a scientific theory.
uskon, että siitä olisi jo tieteellisenä hypoteesina luovuttu.
Scientific experimentation involves tests and measurements which must be repeatable. These test results are evaluated and criticized. Scientists' differences of opinion do not usually question the results as much as their interpretation.
I believe it is important that we understand that the study of evolution, the study of the origins, is not like the study of plants and of animals. Because our worldview is so important for the interpretation of our data, we have the problem that people with a very different worldview reach very different conclusions, starting from the same data.
Evoluutiota kritisoivia tiedemiehiä on
Scientists who are critical of evolutionary theory in its different forms have begun to speak publicly more and more frequently, and dozens of books critical of evolution have been published in recent years.
aina esiintynyt.
Of course, there have always been people of different religious backgrounds who have challenged evolutionary theory, but more and more we see highly qualified scientists doing so these days.
Kriittisesti.
I have a position as a professor and I need to talk only about things which I really understand. I need to try to be as objective as possible. I think this is the major requirement I have as a scientist, as a biologist.
My personal belief is that natural sciences have their own limits. Research is important, but it cannot answer all the questions of life.
Well, I think ideally, academic freedom concept should allow one to freely examine the criticism of Darwinian evolution and the criticisms of chemical evolution in the classroom, and even to discuss the possible alternative interpretations of the data that lead one to an intelligent design paradigm.
A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question.
Dr. Laisler was a research biochemist in Switzerland for a number of years. Whilst there, he gave a lecture in which he cast doubt on the truth of Darwinian evolution.
Esityksen jälkeen
After the lecture, the director of the institute walked angrily out of the lecture hall. I thought that my career as a researcher had just come to an end. These reactions used to bother me a great deal, but nowadays I see them as part of a natural reaction.
At its worst, the battle between the evolutionists and the anti-evolutionists can have drastic consequences. Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe has mathematically questioned the possibility of evolutionary theory. When he did so, he had little idea of the consequences.
Eräs hyvä ystäväni pyysi Wickramasingheä.
A friend of mine asked Wickramasinghe to lecture on the subject at a seminar. He wrote to him in England and received no reply. 6 months later, a letter came from Sri Lanka in which Wickramasinghe said that he had been threatened to the point that someone had said he would burn down his house with him and his family inside it.
Talonsa ja hänet perheineen siinä mukana.
When I think of the fears, uncertainties and doubts which I have had during the last 30 years, when I think of the totally incredible articles I have read about myself, I am amazed.
Vaikka tiedänkin, että suuri osa ihmisiä ei aloita arvioimaan.
Even though I know that the vast majority of people will not start to think or evaluate matters differently, I hope that the younger generations especially will not accept evolution as the only truth. I hope that they will be ready to ponder these matters and see them from different points of view. We have to recognize that science is constantly bringing new light to these questions.
Tämänkin kysymyksen ympärille.